Let's take a look at 2 Chronicles this morning. We won't have to spend as much time introducing this particular book in the Old Testament because it really has the same introduction as 1 Chronicles that we covered last week. This is basically telling the same story we've already seen back in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. But the important difference, as we talked about last week, was of course, this was written later than those earlier books that just talked about the history there, but these books were also written for a different purpose. They record the same events in history, as I said, but they were looking at it from a different perspective. This is one of what we would refer to as the post-exilic writings, and that's just a fancy religious word to mean that this happened, I believe, and most scholars would assume that these two books were written after the exile. Speaking here of the exile of the northern kingdom in 722 BC, that was the northern kingdom of Israel were conquered by the Assyrians and taken into captivity, and then about 150 years later, Judah, the southern kingdom, followed in the footsteps of the Bible kind of refers to those two kingdoms as the older sister and the younger sister. Judah followed the older sister, if you will, into captivity as well at the hands of the Babylonians. And they were in exile for 70 years, 7 decades, a lifetime from our way of looking at it, right? About 70 years, that's an average lifespan. So anyway, after that exile, and we'll see today, I was all ready for Jim this morning. He asked a question last week about Cyrus, and I did stumble across that this week in preparing for this, but we'll catch him next time. Anyway, the Persian king Cyrus, the Persians and Medes conquered the Babylonians, and God led King Cyrus of the Medes and Persians to let the Israelites, the remaining Israelites that survived the captivity, go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and the walls and kind of rebuild their life. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written at that time frame, I believe, just to, again, encourage the people who came back. You know, their lives were wrecked. Their city was destroyed, and those are tough times in life, right? Imagine walking back. You know, I think today about, people go back in and their home's been burned, or the floods in Texas. They go back and just see the devastation, and it's real easy in those times to just kind of throw up your hands and say, I can't take this. I give up. God here through the writer, and I would affirm, 1st and 2nd Chronicles don't tell us who the writer was. Again, I think last week I mentioned a lot of scholars believe it was Ezra who had a hand in leading those captives back, so he would be a likely candidate. But whoever God inspired to write it is telling their story, reminding them of their story, and that God is still at work in their lives, even though they may have some doubts about that at this particular time. Once again, I believe these books were written about 450 to 400 BC, years before Christ. The return from exile took place about 536 BC. So it took a while for the people to make their way back to Jerusalem. Anyway, we've got these books written to encourage the people. In fact, I've chosen the theme for 2nd Chronicles, just a single word, and that's reminder. These people are in desperate need, given their situation in life, to be reminded of some things. And in the difficult times of our life, that's needed as well, right? When you kind of hit rock bottom, and maybe you start to have doubts about this or that spiritually, it's good to go back and just remind ourselves of some things, and that's what I see going on in this particular letter. The post-exilic Jews needed a reminder of who their God was and how he worked, right? After 7 decades, You may begin to have some wonders about that. Does God still care? Does God still have a plan for us as His people? History provided the best lesson for them, and it often does, right? If we're willing to learn from history, sometimes it's those times in life where if the road ahead seems to be kind of dangerous and not many prospects, think back to what God has done and what He promised to continue to do. The author here uses the history of the kingdom of Judah to demonstrate that God blesses His people when they remain faithful and joyfully worship the Lord. And here's just 2 or 3 verses that I think that emphasize this theme of reminding these people. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. And you've probably heard these words before in different contexts. In fact, this is a verse I think that's sometimes grabbed out of context and used in ways perhaps God didn't intend. Wayne? Right. Yeah. Yeah, our plans tend to get in the way too, don't they? We start to think, well, my plan must be what God's plan is. Well, not necessarily. Notice these words, 2 Chronicles 7, verses 12 through 14. It says, Then the Lord appeared to Solomon at night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. And in context, Solomon, of course, was building the physical temple, rebuilding at that time, rebuilding it from the ruins, the temple. I guess that would have been earlier. He built the first one, then that one was destroyed. Anyway, there we all get it right yet. God says, I've chosen this place, this physical place, God says, I'm going to use as a symbol of my presence among my people. God says, if I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locust to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people, and my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn away from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. All right? So this is this idea of a reminder. God's reminding Solomon, the days are going to come when this is going to be destroyed, but yet, and I'll have to bring my judgment due to the people's sins. But if you pay attention and humble yourselves, turn to me from your wicked ways, then God says, I can heal the land once again. All right? So here's a quick outline of the book of 2 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles covered primarily the history concerning King David, and that was important to reestablish. The Messianic line was to come through King David. Well, Solomon's part of that lineage, of course, of David. Solomon was David's son and became king after David. But in 2 Chronicles is primarily the story of Solomon. In David's case, in 1 Chronicles, at that time, the history writer didn't focus too much on David's mistakes, right? It was lifting up David as the ideal king as far as the Messianic line. Solomon doesn't get quite the same treatment because there's mention made again of some of the problems, but chapters 1 through 9 of 2 Chronicles cover the reign of King Solomon. Chapter 1 highlights the wisdom of Solomon. He's known for that, right? If you will, God gave him wisdom. That's what Solomon asked for instead of riches, and God gave him the wisdom as well as the riches and wealth that came with that. Chapter 2 through chapter 5 is the building and furnishing of the temple. That's something his father David had prepared for. David wanted to do it, but God didn't allow it. So David didn't get to do it. So David says, well, I'll just start amassing materials for Solomon to do his job. And so you've got Solomon taking these things with a lot of help, putting them together and building this magnificent temple. Solomon's temple is included in the list of the 7 wonders of the world. It was an amazing place, apparently. Then chapters 6 and 7, Solomon's prayer and the glory of the Lord, amazing chapters that describe, they get this magnificent edifice built, and Solomon, this is the time in Solomon's life when he kind of had his ducks in a row and was doing things right. But Solomon prays to God a dedicatory prayer about this temple, dedicating it to the service of God. And you've got the glory of the Lord in a visual representation coming, and God taking up residence in the temple, not literally in the sense that you can hold the eternal God in one small building. The Acts 17, Paul highlights the fact that, God doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, but God, for the people's sake, under that old covenant, you've got something that the glory of the Lord descended in a visual way, just God showing his favor at this time with the people. Then chapters 8 and 9 chronicle some of the other activities of Solomon, but that's the section of this book talking about the reign of Solomon. Then in chapters 10 through 12, you've got that story that we talked about back in 1st and 2nd Kings about the division of the kingdom. Solomon's sin led God to tear away some of the tribes, and so you got the division. Peter?
Well, he started off by marrying the Egyptian, and it went, that was the start of the whole breakdown.
I forget the numbers exactly. Was it 400 wives and 700 concubines? We're not going to go down that path today, but anyway, that was part of the downfall. And as Peter points out, it was common practice among pagan kings of the day to intermarry with even some of their opponents, because you get a marriage between the kingdoms and then they're not as liable to fight each other. So Solomon took that to the extreme, and it turned out, I believe, first, and it may say it in 2nd Chronicles as well, but at least 2nd Kings talks about how all these wives turned Solomon's heart away from the Lord. And that doesn't mean all the guilt is laid on them. It was Solomon's choice, all right? But that was part of that problem for sure. So you've got the division of the kingdom, chapters 10 through 12, chapters 13 through 36, the first part of chapter 36, a long section there just recounting the history of the decline of Judah, right? Remember we talked about the northern kingdom of Israel never had a good king among the bunch. Judah had a few examples of that, few good ones, but they had a bunch of bad ones as well, primarily evil kings. And Judah followed in the steps of Israel. Several chapters there in this letter. You can read the history. It's not pretty. I think Hezekiah and Josiah were a couple of the good kings at least, but mostly bad. Then finally, right at the end, chapter 36, you've got this decree of Cyrus. Jim mentioned it last week. And here, again, if we want to fit this idea under the theme of God reminding his people through this writer of their history and his plan, ultimately for Israel and all people in the world through the Messiah, this decree of Cyrus is important. Let me just read 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 while we're here. Verses 22 and 23. Probably right near the end. All right. 22 and 23 says, Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among all of you, his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And again, I see this in context of the book of 2 Chronicles as just a reminder that as bad as things seemed, God, what is it, Proverbs talks about the heart of a king is like water in the hand of God or something along that line. And God works even in pagan kingdoms to bring about this result. And don't give up hope, I guess, is the lesson there, right? If God can take a pagan king like Cyrus and get him to do his bidding and let his people go. In fact, I think Jeremiah talks about Cyrus helped fund this return. I mean, the pagan king paid the bill for the people to go back and do what God wanted them to do ultimately. And the people don't need to lose sight of that. All right, before we talk about some lessons, any thoughts on any of that? All right. Here's some things I think we can take away from the book of 2 Chronicles. This might be the most important lesson of all, is that the true God of heaven is incomparable. This book records the history of God's people, but the ultimate lesson is about who God is, right? This judgment came upon God's people from God because of their sin, but God wasn't abandoning them. Notice a couple places this idea about the incomparable God is highlighted in the book of 2 Chronicles. First of all, chapter 6, verse 14. 2 Chronicles 6:14 says, He said, O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. And that, I believe, probably in context is the words of King Solomon. He's built this temple and is dedicating to God. But at that time, Solomon had the right idea. There is no God like the God of heaven. And if he'd have just kept on that path, kept affirming that belief, he would have avoided a lot of trouble. God is incomparable. Then right near the end, chapter 32, verse 7. Notice 7 and 8. Notice what it says. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be dismayed because of the king of Assyria, or because of all the horde that is with him, for the one with us is greater than the one with him. Did you catch that? You know, the writer here is encouraging the people. You know, they know the Assyrians. They've heard about the Assyrians. Massive armies, very, very violent and barbaric people were troubling the people of God, and the writer's reminding them, guess what? Yeah, the king of Assyria has his hordes, but God is greater. He's got his helpers, God has his, and God will prevail. Verse 8, with him is only an arm of flesh, with the king of Assyria. He's got human arms, maybe some pretty strong warrior arms, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. And the people relied on the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So again, in the dark times, difficult times of life, remember that the God we serve is incomparable in power and strength and might and in his plan. There's no God like him. There's no human ruler that's powerful enough to ultimately thwart what God's trying to do, right? Good thing to remember. We've got that story we could rehash, and we don't have to do this because we talked about it back in 2 Kings, but remember the story of King Rehoboam, the first king of the divided kingdom. He was the king of Judah, and he took the advice of the young advisors over the advice the old advisors were giving him. You know, unite, go easy on them, unite the people. And of course the young bucks that were Rehoboam's age, says, "No, let's show him who's in charge here." And it turned out to be advice that further divided the kingdom. So don't ignore the advice of those with experience. That's a good lesson in life. Experience given by older people isn't always true. It isn't always best, but it's usually better than someone who thinks they have all the answers without the experience, right? Sometimes you got to get knocked down a few times in life to have some good advice about those times, don't you? You've been through it, right? Sometimes it's hard to listen to that for the younger generation, but doesn't mean it's not good advice. Also, beware of the temptation to forsake God when things are going well. We've talked about this before, but that's probably the most dangerous time in your spiritual life. And you might say, that doesn't make sense, right? Isn't it more dangerous for your faith when things seem to be falling apart? No, not really. Your faith can be in danger when things are going bad. But biblically, if you trace out the stories, it's those times when Israel had everything going for them that what did they do? Look at us. We're pretty bad. And bad in a good way, like they say it these days, right? It's times of prosperity when they got in trouble. 2 Chronicles highlights that in the story of Judah. 2 Chronicles 12, verse 1 says, when the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, and what you want to read the rest of that verse is they served God even more. No, it says, when the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, it says, he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Why pay attention to the law of the Lord? We're doing pretty good on our own. 2 Chronicles 25, verse 2. He, in context here, it's King Amaziah. When Amaziah, did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart. Now it came about as soon as the kingdom was firmly in his grasp, guess what happened? He killed his servants who had slain his father the king. Well, that happened a lot in transitions between kings, but not a good choice. Then in chapter 26, verse 16, but when he, and the he here is Uzziah, became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly, and he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, for he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of God, something God had forbidden. That wasn't the king's job. But Uzziah had reached the point, I'm strong, nobody can challenge me, and it led him down the wrong path. So again, the idea here is be careful about the temptation to give up on God when things are going well. You know what? It's kind of human nature to start to take the credit for ourselves, isn't it? Be careful of that. Not that you can't long for the things to go well. The idea here isn't that, well, okay, if it's dangerous for things to go well, then I'll pray to God that my life's a mess. No, that's not what we're talking about. God desires to bless us, but don't think you can leave God out there when things are going well. Here's another lesson. Remember to let God weigh in on your decisions. And this may fit with what we just talked about. When things are going well and we're strong and mighty and, everything's kind of clicking right along, we get our ducks in a row. As I saw a meme the other day, it was pretty cute. I saw 5 or 6 ducks were sitting right up beside each other and says, I finally did it. All my ducks are in a row. You got to, part of that temptation is to say, well, I don't need God's help in making this decision. Well, there's no decision out there. Some decisions may be pretty easy to make, but I would encourage you never to leave God out of the decision-making process, right? Here's an example. In 2 Kings 18, verses 3 and 4, you've got King Ahab of Israel. He was a wicked king. He's trying to work with King Jehoshaphat of Judah. It says, Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, will you go with me against Ramoth Gilead? And he said to him, I am as you are, and my people as your people. We will be with you in the battle. But if you trace the story out, Jehoshaphat kind of paused for a minute and thought more about it. He says, let's find out what God would want us to do here. And if you know the story, Jehoshaphat says, let's ask the prophets whether we ought to be making this alliance and going out to battle. And, of course, King Ahab had his yes prophets. He had a whole line of prophets that wouldn't ever challenge the king. They'd always give him a good word. And Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, kind of saw through that and says, isn't there a prophet isn't there a prophet here that would say otherwise, or something like that? And Ahab, you remember the story, says, well, there is Micaiah, I believe is his name. I'm just trying to remember all this. And he says, but the king says he never says anything good about me. And but to Jehoshaphat's credit, he says, rather than rushing out to this in this alliance to go to battle, let's find out what God would have us do. And that was a good thing. Let God weigh in on your decisions, even the simple ones in life. Here's an example to think about, or a lesson. Live your life so others will regret your passing. Almost seems morbid to think about it, but, it is something to pause and consider, right? Listen to this in chapter 21, verse 20. It says, he, or King Jehoram in context, was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. And notice this phrase, and he departed or died with no one's regret. What a sad ending to a life, right? I'm not saying that we ought to live our life just so we get the praise heaped on us from, our friends and enemies or whatever. That shouldn't be the purpose of our life, but if we're living as God calls us to live, then hopefully that will put us in a place where when the time comes for me to pass or for you to pass on, people will reflect on a life well lived, right? Aim to live your life so that you won't have to depart with no one's regret. What that implies is the people are thinking it's almost better he's gone or she's gone. So I've got 3 or 4 more here. Let me just mention them in passing, and you can check these out later if you like. We've got the story of the lesson of choosing your counselors carefully. That's not the story of Rehoboam, but King Azariah chose it got him in trouble. God will strengthen those who surrender their hearts to him. That's always true. Think about your own sins before treating others harshly. You learn that lesson in the book of 2 Chronicles. It's the New Testament idea of, we tend to judge others harshly, but let our own sins slide. Remember that sometimes there are mitigating circumstances to consider when obeying the Lord. You got to think through some things carefully there. And not that you change what God said about a matter, but sometimes you've got to come at different angles because of all the factors involved. It takes some wise thinking, some careful counsel maybe from others, and to sort your way through all of that. All right, time's up. Thank you for working through that. We'll move on. Let's see. 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles. Is it Ezra next? See, I'm having to remember. Anyway, next one in line in your Old Testament. Prepare for that next week, if you would. Thank you.